Good morning and welcome to my micro-teach session. I'm Heather Bates and I work as a community practice teacher in school nursing. I recently delivered this session at a sexual health update training day for school health nurses and health visitors. Just to set some context, there can be some confusion within the health professions regarding the use of Gillick competency and Fraser guidelines. So the aim of this teaching session was to clarify their use for school health nurses and health visitors. Just for initial clarity, the term Gillick competency is a legal term. This is used for under 16-year-olds when they are being assessed whether they are capable or not to consent to their own medical treatment, often against their parents' wishes. The Fraser guidelines are a set of questions to be asked to establish if a young person under 16 years old is of sufficient age and understanding to be competent and to receive contraceptive advice or treatment, again, often without their parents' knowledge or consent. My objectives for this teaching session is to gain a clear understanding of Fraser guidelines and Gillick competencies, the key points in using them in practice, and documenting the assessment. In 1980, the Department of Health and Social Security issued guidance for family planning services which said that in exceptional circumstances a doctor or other health professional could give contraceptive advice and treatment to girls under 16. In 1982, Mrs. Gillick claimed that this guidance was unlawful, and she took her local authority and the Department of Health and Social Security to court. This was in an attempt to try to stop doctors from giving contraceptive advice or treatment to under 16-year-olds without their parents knowing. Initially, the courts ruled in Mrs. Gillick's favour, basing their decision on the belief that doctors or health professionals may encourage girls to have underage sex by doing this. The case then went to the High Court, where Mr. Justice Wolfe dismissed Mrs. Gillick's claims. Mr. Justice Wolfe said that whether or not a child is capable of giving the necessary consent will depend on the child's maturity and understanding, but also the nature of what consent is actually required. He said further that if a child must be capable of assessing advantages and disadvantages of the treatment proposed, so if the consent is given, it can be properly and fairly described as true consent. The Court of Appeal reversed this decision, and in 1985, bearing in mind this is 3 years following Mrs. Gillick's original complaint, the case then went to the House of Lords, who ruled in favour of the original judgment. Lord Fraser was the Lord leading the judgment, and it is on his judgment that the guidelines are based. The Fraser guidelines are there to protect the young person. They state that the young person must understand the advice and have sufficient maturity to understand what is involved. They also state that the doctor or health professional dealing with that young person could not persuade the young person to inform their parents, nor allow the doctors to inform them on their behalf. The young person would be very likely to begin or continue having sexual intercourse with or without the contraceptive treatment. Also, without contraceptive advice or treatment, the young person's physical or mental health could potentially suffer. And finally, it would be in the young person's best interest to give such advice or treatment without their parents' knowledge. So what factors enable a practitioner to make a clear judgment whether the young person is or is not Fraser competent? They need to establish the sexual relationship isn't an abusive one, and also the age of the partner. They need to ensure the young person understands what sexual intercourse actually is and what are the risks that are involved. They need to try and encourage the young person to share the information with their parents, although acknowledging that this is often difficult. They need to be aware of the risks to the young person if they are likely to continue to have sex, whether they receive advice or not. The physical and mental health of the young person is likely to suffer if the advice is not given, and it's in the young person's best interest to give them the contraceptive advice or treatment without their parents knowing. This is further endorsed by the NMC, our Nursing and Midwifery Council. Health professionals will often say that someone who has been judged competent against these guidelines are often said to be Fraser competent. Sometimes Fraser competency is not so easy to assess. This can be in particular when a young person is under 13 years old, and also maybe if they have some poor understanding, for example some learning difficulties. In both incidents, safeguarding procedures will be required. Usually treatment can still be given, but follow-up is essential. It's equally important that the documentation of the assessment takes place, whether the young person is Fraser competent or not. What we document and how we document that Fraser competence has been assessed will vary between organisations. In my current organisation, we document that they have been assessed as being Gillick competent using the Fraser guidelines. If they are not assessed as being competent, we would still treat them, but we'd need to discuss, as I said earlier, with other professionals, and follow-up is essential. So to summarise, Gillick competence is a term used in medical law to decide whether anyone under 16 years old can consent to their own treatment. Fraser guidelines, on the other hand, are used specifically for contraception advice and treatment. Sometimes we will see this recorded as being Fraser competent, and that means that a young person has been assessed against the Fraser guidelines. For example, a child in hospital is assessed as being Gillick competent to see whether they're capable of making a decision themselves about whether they receive treatment or not against their parents' wishes. The same rule applies in the community. For example, when a school nurse is giving an immunisation to a child, they assess them as being Gillick competent if they're able to receive that immunisation without their parents' knowledge. If as a school nurse or another health professional you were seeing a young person about contraceptive advice, you would document it that they'd been assessed as being Gillick competent but using the Fraser guidelines. These are the references that I used putting together this short teaching presentation. Thank you for listening.